Greetings and welcome to another edition of Montpelier Connection. We're here at the Statehouse in Montpelier. We're into the 5th week of the session, and today's guest is my district mate and the chair of the Wet and Wild Committee, David Deen.
Fish, Wildlife, and Water Resources.
Yep. You have quite an agenda this year, don't you?
Yes, it's a big agenda, not a whole lot of different items, but a big agenda. Next week we will take testimony on this notion of reversing the direction of flow of a pipeline that goes through Vermont in the Northeast Kingdom, and that would be used as opposed to moving oil up to Canada for refining, used to ship tar sands from Canada to Portland, Maine, in order to transship it down to refineries along the Gulf Coast. And tar sands are a very different kind of material than oil is, and the pipelines are old, and there is a great deal of concern for potential environmental impacts. So we will be taking up a bill that would require an Act 250 review of any reversal of direction of flow and change of the material that would actually be moving through the pipeline.
There's some serious concerns about this now. Is there a timeline that we're on for this, or?
The company that owns the pipeline continues to say that they have no immediate plans for moving tar sands through that pipeline, but they have started such a project once and stopped it, started it again and stopped it, and went so far as to get what's called a jurisdictional opinion from the District Environmental Commission in the Northeast Kingdom, and that opinion said that an Act 250 permit was not required. As the sponsor of the bill, I'm very concerned that we would not have that level of environmental review for something that has that much potential impact on our environment. So there's no direct timeline. We don't know that a pipeline is going to start immediately, but they have talked about it twice, and we want to be sure.
There have been a number of instances now where concerns have arisen, environmental concerns about local input. Wind towers are one, cell towers are another, now this pipeline. Has anything changed in the way Act 250 or local regulations are being adhered to, or input from local people on these kinds of decisions?
Yeah, one of the things that we've run into, and it has involved Entergy, it has involved cell towers, it has involved this pipeline proposal, in that the federal government has taken sole responsibility for safety, and consequently local jurisdictions like a state cannot address safety concerns. I know that it also applies to railroads. The Surface Transportation Act takes states and local jurisdictions completely out of review of rail lines, including Act 250. Rail lines are exempt from Act 250. So that's one complication. We can't look at things for safety, and I presume everybody's aware of the decision relative to Vermont Yankee, but it applies to, as I said, rail lines and oil pipelines also. But what we can look at are environmental impacts.
And that's where you were coming from when you put that bill in regarding the pipeline?
Right, and it is drafted carefully so that there's no hint that, in fact, we would be dealing with safety per se. We will be dealing with potential environmental impacts.
Now, at the end of last year and before the session, you've been talking about stormwater runoff. Is that something you're taking up in committee?
Yeah, that's the other major issue. Last session, we gave instructions to the Agency of Natural Resources to begin the research stage of putting together a clean water fund that would address runoff from both urban areas as well as agricultural runoff. And as I think I've said throughout this discussion, back in the 70s when the Clean Water Act became law and we decided that we were going to clean up individual direct discharges of pollutants to the waters of the United States, we made that a shared responsibility, and that broad-based taxes paid for that cleanup. And we saw some pretty astounding results. With stormwater, this non-point source runoff from agricultural fields and parking lots and buildings and other impervious surfaces, we have left it up to the individual. We have not taken a society-wide responsibility. And one of the things we're trying to build with the Clean Water Fund is a broad-based contributing tax or fee or other means of addressing these sources of pollution the way that we addressed direct discharges back in the 70s, 80s, and into the 90s.
Now, they had problems again in Lake Champlain this summer, didn't they, with algae blooms?
Yes, and a lot of it, at least according to the testimony that we've had, a lot of it was due to the extreme high water event in 2011. One of the things about Lake Champlain and the tributaries that are going into it, the nutrient of concern is phosphorus. And phosphorus binds to soil particles, so that when we had all of that discharge and all of that erosion going into the lake, it built up the level of phosphorus, and we saw the results this past year. Water that didn't smell very well, water that was not safe to swim in for animals or humans, and fish kills that were the result of this accelerated plant growth, both algae and rooted plants, aquatic plants, that really degraded the water quality.
And the source is agricultural phosphorus?
Well, the studies that have been done on Lake Champlain apportion various contributions to direct discharges from wastewater treatment facilities, to urban runoff, and to agricultural runoff. And I believe, if my memory is serving me, that some 60% of the phosphorus loading in Lake Champlain is due to agricultural activities. That leaves just under half of all of the nutrient loading to those other sources, urban runoff and direct discharges from wastewater treatment facilities.
When you say urban runoff, you mean parking lots?
Parking lots, buildings, roads. The Agency of Transportation, as part of the legislative work we did last year, is adopting new best management practices for roads. A lot of the Vermont's road network is dirt. I mean, it's still gravel roads. And when you get a big rain event or snow melt or whatever, it moves a lot of that dirt. And as I just said, the soil particles bind with phosphorus and move that into the lake. In the Connecticut River watershed, the concern is nitrogen. And it's because Long Island Sound, which is the terminus of the Connecticut River down south a ways, has dense areas, the same as the Mississippi River causes in the Gulf of Mexico, because of nitrogen buildup, because nitrogen is it stimulates plant growth. And when that plant growth dies, it in fact sucks oxygen out of the water. So There are dead zones in the Long Island Sound as there are at the mouth of the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico.
So we do have concerns in the Connecticut that we need to be aware of and address.
Yes, and the work that we're doing with this Clean Water Fund is for all watersheds.
Sounds like a lot you've got going on in your committee. In the bigger picture, we've got a pretty ambitious agenda here this year. We're moving ahead with healthcare reform. We just heard from Mark Larson, who's the head of the Department of Health Access, and they're getting ready to roll out the health exchange in October, and they're getting ready to send people out into the communities, and something I want to talk to you about, because he said they can bring people down into our neck of the woods to look at that. We did see a preview of the web portal, and it looks good. It looks easy. Alongside that, we're going to be hiring navigators to work in the community for people who don't have access, or who are not
web savvy.
Web savvy, so there's going to be different options for that. Are there other things on the big picture that you're keeping your eye on?
Well, as many people know, I'm the river steward for the Connecticut River, and there are two major activities that the Connecticut River Watershed Council is involved with. The hydroelectric dams on the main stem of the Connecticut River, Wilder, Bellows Falls, and Vernon, are all three going up for relicensing. Their licenses...
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. Their licenses expire in 2018, and that sounds like it's a long way off, but it's not, because it's such a complex and demanding process to get through to the license on time that we're starting now. And there have been site visits for all interested parties, including all the resource agencies from Vermont, New Hampshire, the federal government, all the non-governmental organizations, better known as NGOs. We toured the facilities, and we took boat rides up through the reservoir areas to look at things such as wildlife, erosion, recreational use, and other stuff. That happened back in October. We have just completed what are called the scoping meetings, which is FERC convenes meetings at the local level in order to talk with people interested in the relicensing process and get a read on what their concerns are about the operations of the dams. There was one for the Wilder Dam. Actually, there are two for the Wilder Dam, a shared one for the Bellows Falls Wilder Dam, and an evening meeting in Bellows Falls the 29th of January, I guess just passed. Now we go on to a more formal process within FERC in writing comments on what are called the preliminary application documents, which lay out what the dams are, what the owners say are their concerns. Another passerby had a message for us, what their concerns are about the dam. Those meetings were well attended. There are also two dams in Massachusetts, two hydroelectric facilities in Massachusetts, one dam and one pump storage operation at Northfield Mountain. Those meetings had even more people. The one I attended down there for Turner's Falls and Vernon Dam had over 120 people who showed up. So there's a lot of interest, and these licenses last for 30 years. So what we do now is what we're going to have to live with for the next 30 years. It's very, very difficult to change license conditions once the license is issued. So it's really important for people, watch the newspapers, all the meetings have to be warned, and the papers have been carrying notices of when these meetings are being held. The other thing that's still going on is the Public Service Board hearings for a certificate of public good for the Vermont Yankee plant. Yes, they have their federal license from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, but they need a certificate of public good from the state of Vermont in order to continue to operate. and those proceedings are underway now. Technical hearings begin next week. The Watershed Council and the Vermont Natural Resources Council are in harness together in front of the Public Service Board, and our issues are water. The NRC is concerned about groundwater as a result of the tritium leak, and the Watershed Council is concerned about the thermal discharge into the Connecticut River. So, and both are extremely intense processes that take a lot of time, and as you've already said, we've got a lot going on up here in the legislature. So,
one of the concerns there is the raising the water temperature of the Connecticut River because of their discharge. That's what you mean by thermal discharge?
Excuse me, yes, that's exactly it.
And what's the range that you feel environmentally is safe, and where are we at?
Well, part of it is that very small changes in temperature regime change how fish relate to their environment. And shad, American shad, they are an anadromous fish. They come back to the river in the springtime to spawn, and the water temperature is what triggers their spawning activity. And what has been happening, at least what we are claiming, what has been happening in the case of the Vermont Yankee thermal discharge is that the fish are spawning downriver because the temperature of the river is elevated and triggers that spawning response, and they are not continuing their migration upriver. So that the fish, the American shad, the limit of their historic range has been Bellows Falls. They could never make it over the natural falls there. But they're stopping south of us. They're stopping down in Turner's Falls. They're stopping between Turner's Falls and Vernon. They are not making it above the Vernon Dam, even though we know that that fish ladder works. So that's an example of the kind of concerns that we have with this thermal discharge coming out from Vermont Yankee. There have been recent decisions around the country where operating nuclear plants have been required to create cooling capacity so that they do not eat up rivers like the Hudson River. That's where the biggest recent decision has been rendered. And there, the plant has to build cooling towers. Vermont Yankee has cooling towers, 22 of them, already on site, and the issue is whether they're going to use part of their generated electricity to run those fans or not, or have it available for sale on the open market. So for us, it's a question of them making more money at the expense of the river.
Now, last week we were treated to a talk by Bill McKibben, Vermonter from Middlebury, Vermont, who has been raising the flag about global warming and climate change, and started the organization 350.org. Any thoughts on his speech to us?
You know, I've got to admit, and I don't mean to bag you, but I was at the Public Service Board hearing. It was oral arguments. Entergy, Vermont Yankee, is trying to knock the Connecticut River watershed out of the case, and we had to be there to defend why it was that we should be part of the case. And so I have heard him speak and read some of his stuff, and if you don't believe climate change is underway, then you haven't been paying attention to what's happened in Vermont since 2011, since the spring of 2011, in terms of the rain events, the flooding, the severity of the storms that have cost Vermont communities and the state well in excess of $300 million worth of damage to our infrastructure, and that was from just Irene. Yeah. So I'm with the man.
We're seeing all across the country now non-believers are getting whacked by the weather and saying, well, maybe there is something to this. And I appreciate what you're trying to do in your committee and what we're trying to do. There's a big push this year for thermal efficiency in the same way that we have tackled electric efficiency in the past. And I support those efforts. I think that there's no need for us to heat the great outdoors in the winter, as they say, and there's a lot of old housing stock in Vermont that does just that. And the cheapest electricity or energy in general is the one you don't have to produce. So I think efficiency, conservation are areas where we can really do a lot more, and I'm looking forward to see how we can affect those policies this session.
Yeah, it's going to be a big part of the work coming out of the Natural Resources Committee.
Anything else you'd like to mention before we head out today?
No, well, we're back in session, and as we are speaking, we are anticipating the arrival of a big snowstorm. And this is one of those confluences of two low-pressure systems that may become the perfect storm and may become another example of extreme weather patterns relative to climate change. Albeit it's going to be cold, not warm, but this is the kind of storm that is being predicted under climate change models.
And in some ways, we've had a pretty bare winter so far, so those of us who like to see some snow are happy for it. On the other hand, let's just hope it's not a storm that produces damage and puts people out of power for too long.
Or puts people at risk.
At risk. Well, thanks a lot for your time.
Alrighty,
thanks for your work here. And that's it for another edition of Montpelier Connection from the State House. This is Representative Mike Mrowicki with David Deen. Thanks to all the people at BCTV for helping bring the State House back home. And please feel free to keep in touch with us. I have a website, Windham4, that's the number 4.net. David and I have our contact information on there. We want to hear from you, so please feel free to do so. Until next time, take care.